Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Today, I have Miranda Devine with me. She is a journalist and all-around truth teller. You've likely seen her columns in the New York Post or heard her research into the Biden family in her previous book, The Laptop from Hell, or her most recent book, which is titled The Big Guy. Of course, The Big Guy, How a President and His Son Sold Out America. Miranda, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tudor. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. So we were just talking before we went on, and I really want to kind of dig into the pardon of Hunter Biden because I feel like it just disappeared. Everybody moved on. There's so much happening with the new administration and the appointments that come out every day. But this was significant. You've written a lot about it. So could you kind of do a deep dive into what this means?
Sure. It is pretty egregious, Tudor. It's a situation where we've all known, I guess, for at least 4 years that Hunter Biden was influence peddling using his father's name to extract millions of dollars from America's adversaries during his father's vice presidency. And we also have discovered, partly due to Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop, but also due to various whistleblowers, that Joe Biden was intimately involved in that family business. And his brother, Jim Biden, was also involved, fully expecting Jim Biden to get a pardon soon. But the Hunter Biden pardon, I was not surprised that Joe Biden did this. I found it more surprising that anyone was surprised because regardless of the fact that Joe Biden had said about a dozen times, either he or the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, had vowed that he would never pardon his son. And, you know, all these Democrats were saying that Joe Biden was so honest and upright and believed in the rule of law. So, of course, he wouldn't do that. That was surprising that anyone believed Joe Biden because his entire career is littered with or marked by lies and exaggerations, plagiarism, you name it. I guess what did surprise me was just the extent of this pardon, because Joe Biden has gone back 11 years, not 10, 11, back to 2014. And 2014 is important because that was in February of 2014, that was the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. And that was the beginning of Joe Biden's being the emperor of Ukraine. Barack Obama had entrusted him with carriage of a lot of foreign policy, and particularly in countries like Ukraine and China, where most of the Biden family grift was occurring. And so Joe Biden would fly into Ukraine throughout 2014, and he would lecture the Ukrainians about corruption. He would say corruption is a cancer. And yet they knew that his son Hunter was sitting on the board of the most corrupt company in Ukraine, Burisma. And so that Hunter joined the Burisma board, paid about $1 million a year in April of 2014. And that's why the pardon stretches back to 2014. And as well, I mean, the following year came the quid pro quo. Hunter Biden, as soon as he joined the Burisma board, you can see from emails, and we've also been told by various whistleblowers that he was being pressured by the owner of Burisma to do something to get the Burisma, the Ukrainian prosecutors, off his back to stop that investigation. It's explicitly spelled out in emails to Hunter, and sure enough, the following year we discover that Joe Biden has used his power and influence to force the firing of an honest prosecutor in Ukraine.
I think it's so interesting because he goes back 11 years, and this covers the time where Donald Trump says, I think there might have been something fishy happening in Ukraine, and he gets impeached over it. And now it's almost like you can't investigate even whether that impeachment was legitimate because Joe Biden has wiped an entire more than a decade off the map of investigation, which is pretty disgusting.
You're so right. Joe Biden sort of got away scot-free. And a lot of the reason for that is not because he's so wily and cunning, although he is, but it's because he had the backing of the intelligence community, whether it was the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, the Department of Justice, all of them in one way or another conspired to protect the Bidens from, I guess, the China money and the China grift. But I think primarily it was Ukraine. They did not want anyone looking too closely at Biden activities in Ukraine. And sure enough, Donald Trump was impeached effectively for Joe Biden's sins in Ukraine.
Well, and Ukraine is not, it's a notoriously corrupt country. We hold them up now like little angels, but they are a notoriously corrupt country. That's why you have this faction of the United States that is saying, why are we pouring massive amounts of money, billions of dollars into Ukraine when we don't actually know if we can trust the government there? And we don't know what our government has done in the past with Ukraine. What do you think this means going forward with this war with Russia and Ukraine, when we know that the Ukrainians have historically been corrupt? I mean, the ambassador that went over there was supposed to root out corruption. And now with these billions of dollars going there, this guy that's running around in his, pajamas practically as president of the country, it just all seems very fishy.
Look, it does. And you really can't extricate the Biden corruption from the Ukraine corruption from the current war. And remember, the Biden family also received millions of dollars from Russia as well, from an oligarch there. Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. It's been ruled by oligarchs who sort of vie with each other, and various of them curry favor with various administrations, whether it be the Clintons or the Bidens, at various times, and they pit one another against each other. And so it's just impossible to unravel who's who in the zoo. You can't tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And so now we, as Americans, are enmeshed in this disastrous war, and it's up to Donald Trump now to put an end to it. And, with the Biden corruption and the millions of dollars that they have received from foreign countries, it's so hard to figure out how compromised Joe Biden is. You can see just now with some of the pardons that he's been doling out to Chinese spies, for instance. What drives that? The sort of weakening of the Trump era sanctions and policies against China by Joe Biden. Is that a genuinely sort of foreign policy change? Or is it driven by the fact that Hunter Biden and Jim Biden received millions of dollars from China? It's very difficult to extract the reality from the corruption. And that is very dangerous for America, because we're talking about matters of life and death, war and peace.
Why haven't we heard more about the laptop? I mean, we obviously, Joe Biden has been in office, but shouldn't you have a Department of Defense and a Department of Justice that are looking at foreign interference and taking that seriously outside of who's in the White House?
Well, I mean, the entire way the laptop was treated from the beginning has been really sinister. And in fact, I was just talking to someone the other day who was very high up in the FBI at that point, since retired. But he said that the laptop, when it was brought in December 2019, it was subpoenaed from the owner of that computer repair shop in Delaware, where Hunter Biden had abandoned 3 waterlogged laptops. That was finally brought in December of 2019 by the FBI, but it wasn't taken to the sort of scientific and forensic department that all other devices are. For instance, the Hillary Clinton laptop from her assistant, that was recovered there. And any time there's a device that's picked up in an investigation, that's taken to this particular department of the FBI to be unencrypted or whatever, examined. Hunter Biden's laptop was put in a separate alleyway from the beginning. It was never made available to the IRS investigators who were there in Delaware investigating Hunter Biden for all manner of allegations and charges. So it was always treated in a secretive and different manner. And when we at the New York Post first broke the stories from the laptop, the first one was about Joe Biden meeting with one of Hunter Biden's Ukrainian business partners from that corrupt company, Burisma. We had big tech censor us, and we only found out later on that we were censored not because, as we thought at the time, Twitter and Facebook were sort of woke and didn't like Donald Trump and wanted Joe Biden to win. What had happened was the FBI had gone into those companies for weeks before the election and had pre-bunked our story. They had told those companies to look out for a Russian hack and leak operation, likely in October, likely involving Hunter Biden. And so on October 14, 2020, just 3 weeks before the 2020 election, when Facebook and Twitter saw our story, they immediately recognized it for what the FBI had been warning them about. And so they censored us within a few hours. That was really a sort of an election interference operation by the FBI. Similarly, with a few days later, there was what I call the Dirty 51 letter written by the 51 former intelligence officials, falsely claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop and therefore our stories were Russian disinformation, or what they said was had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. That was, again, like a CIA election interference operation, because that letter was approved at the highest levels of the CIA. It went to the desk of Gina Haspel, then the CIA director, and she gave it the green light. And it was instigated by the Biden campaign, by Antony Blinken, now the benighted Secretary of State, but then a senior advisor in the Biden campaign. He phoned a former acting director of the CIA, Mike Morell, who was hoping to be named as Biden's CIA director, and put the idea into his mind. And we know that because Morell testified under oath in a congressional hearing behind closed doors. And Morell said he didn't even consider doing that, getting a letter written, until Blinken called him. Blinken's denied it, but, we can, I guess, take his denials with a grain of salt. So the CIA was involved. There were 5 former directors or acting directors who signed that letter. And also many of those signatories, most of them of the 51 were CIA. They were active contractors at the time, all retained, I think, except John Brennan, who was stripped of it by Donald Trump, their security clearances. And I think when Donald Trump comes back into office after January 20, one of the first things he'll be doing is stripping those 51 of their security clearances.
Well, and I think nobody is surprised that he pardoned his son, but I think it sets an incredibly dangerous precedent, because this is somebody who worked in government, sold access to government for years. We don't even know how long it went on, because he had classified documents in his house from when he was a senator. It's like, how did you get classified documents out as a senator? And yet he obviously did. So the question is, how deep, how far back does this go? I mean, obviously he pardoned him for 11 years, but also the pardon is not meant to be used to get your family members off if they're bringing money into your house. I mean, when we talked about the fact that they were covering for Joe Biden and election interference, well, this is also national security interference. I mean, this is a massive disaster if your president of the United States is compromised, and he's still compromised, until he's not president anymore and he goes to the nursing home or wherever he's going to end up. But the problem I have with this is that the precedent has now been set to pardon your family members for anything that they've done. So what happens if another corrupt president gets in and they want to make money off of being? I mean, I just think that you cannot rule out the fact that people who are hungry for power and become president could potentially take this as a, hey, I can do this too.
You're so right. And, for Joe Biden, who came into office promising that he was going to restore norms and the adults were going to be back in charge, with a sly dig at Donald Trump. He's broken every norm possible, and he sort of gets away with it because he just lies and pretends that what he's doing isn't untoward. And I guess the media protects him for that. But you're quite right. It's just a sort of a green light for corruption. And that was not what the pardon powers were supposed to be for. And, there is so much going back in the entirety of, I guess, Joe Biden's half century in office. From his very earliest days, he was parlaying his unique position in this unique state of Delaware, which is a small state, sort of not very notable for anything, except that it is sort of the Liechtenstein of America, because it has these very opaque sort of corporate governance rules, and therefore many American companies are headquartered there. And that made Joe Biden a very influential character, because all these companies were donating to him and asking for favors. And he had managed to he came into the Senate very young. He was just 30 years old. But he was very quickly identified as somebody who was, I guess, useful to the powers that be, and elevated above his abilities to the most powerful committee, or committees, actually, both the Judiciary and the Foreign Relations Committee. He was either chairman or ranking member of Foreign Relations for over a decade. And that put him in a very powerful position. And you can see going back through his Senate career that he would get all sorts of favors, whether it was inflated salary positions for family members like Hunter, or, his houses bought at a high price, houses sold to him at a low price. He certainly lived way beyond the means of a senator. And he used to boast, as he does, sort of confronting his malfeasance sort of in the face and daring you to sort of question him. He would say that he was renowned as the poorest man in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Yet he lived in DuPont mansions, dressed spectacularly as Kitty Kelly wrote in this wonderful profile back in the 80s, dressed like the Great Gatsby. All his family went to Ivy League schools, whether it was kids or grandkids, all had magic carpet rides, thanks to Joe Biden. And Hunter Biden was really deputized as the bag man for the family. And he would, with these inflated salaries, and then later on when they internationalized this influence peddling program and the money turned into millions of dollars from foreign sort of shady characters, Hunter Biden would be funding the family members. You can see a little bit of that on the laptop, with Hunter paying for the sort of maintenance and upkeep on Joe Biden's estate in Delaware, and paying for a cell phone. And Hunter himself complained bitterly that he was having to fund the entire family for years and pay half his salary to Pop, which was Joe.
Right. Well, it's interesting. There's a few things here that I want to break down, because you talk about the fact that the family came into so much money, but we started talking about Ukraine and the oligarchs that have so much power. Now, when Joe Biden was a young man in the Senate, he spoke adamantly against corporate interests playing in elections, and that this money shouldn't be coming into elections. And it made it harder for a real good guy like him to be winning elections, because he was up against all of these executives that knew all of the money people. but he figured out that game really quickly. And I would argue that we have somewhat of an oligarch system here where these folks, I mean, I see it in Michigan, I see it in other states, the most powerful people, they feel like they get to move the chess pieces on the board. And ultimately, it's the American people who are getting the screw job, really, because they're not in that position of power. I think that's where Donald Trump has been different, because he was like, fine, you don't want to give me money, I'll do it without you. And people are like, he can't. We move the chess pieces, but the American people believed in him. He got these small dollar donations. It was actually the people coming around him. Is it possible, because everybody says the future is JD Vance and everything has changed, but is it possible to break that system of billionaires moving the chess pieces in the United States, when that's obviously how Joe Biden got to be president?
Isn't it interesting that Donald Trump did manage to stay afloat with just the faith and small dollar donations of everyday Americans? But now, there are Silicon Valley billionaires like Elon Musk are flocking to him. They've seen that he can change the world. And they also, I guess, if you listen to people like Mark Anderson, were terrified about what the Biden administration meant for freedom, whether it was freedom of speech or freedom in the new cryptocurrency market. I guess there was a lot of projection from the Biden-Harris people when they accused Donald Trump of authoritarianism, because that's in their DNA. And the power of the donors you saw really starkly when the sort of coup against Joe Biden unfolded. Yes. Because he was determined to hang on after that disastrous debate with Donald Trump when he just collapsed on stage. And he was sort of getting away with it for a couple of weeks. And then you saw things change. And, you heard whispers that the donors had decided to close their wallets. And what came out much later, in fact, I remember the article in the New York Times that surprised me, buried in the bottom of this September 24 piece, was a little mention about how Kamala Harris's best friend, or one of her best friends, Lorene Jobs, I think she's the wealthiest woman in America, the widow of Steve Jobs, she had funded some polling after the debate, some focus group work, which she then circulated among the other donors. And it showed that there was no way Joe Biden could win the election, that keeping on with him was a guarantee that Donald Trump would win. And that really was very influential. And when that story in the New York Times came out, you saw Joe Biden suddenly change his attitude towards Kamala Harris. It was as if he didn't realize that she'd stabbed him in the back. And suddenly he was bigfooting her. He walked into the press briefing room at the White House for the first time in his entire presidency, right at the moment that she was taking to the stage in Detroit. And all the cameras were on her. All the cameras swung away from her onto Joe Biden, who didn't have a lot to say except that he and Kamala Harris were joined at the hip, singing from the same songbook. She owns all our policies. And then he did it again a little while later with supporting the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, saying what a great guy he was and how during hurricane preparations that they were constantly in contact. This was straight after Kamala Harris had picked a fight with Ron DeSantis and said how terrible he was. So that was Joe Biden showing Kamala Harris that he knew what she'd done and that he was never going to forgive her. And sure enough, you've seen in recent weeks how cold, how frosty Jill Biden, the First Lady, has been towards Kamala Harris. Refuses to even look at her. The other night at the Kennedy Center Awards, both Joe and Jill refused to even look at Kamala Harris when they were sitting next to her.
I mean, I have to say, there's never a time when you, as a woman, know you're going to be on camera and you just throw something on. I think the fact that Jill Biden decided to go vote in a red suit,
yes,
was
Saga.
yes. Yeah. She that was a middle finger to Kamala Harris.
100%. And look, I even wonder if Joe Biden, remember he put on the MAGA hat when he went
Yeah.
and visited some firefighters or some first responders? And everyone thought, oh, that's just Joe. Maybe he's like so befuddled he didn't realize what he was doing, or, maybe it was just a joke. Everything that politicians do in front of the camera, especially someone as seasoned as Joe Biden, they know exactly the message they're sending.
Yeah, and I think that so this is where I think people have forgiven the pardon and all of that because they're like, "Oh, he's elderly. This man is confused. He doesn't know what he's doing." But those were moments where I agree with you. He has done this his whole life. This is I mean, it's like even when you see the scene of the woman who is in the nursing home and they say she's got Alzheimer's and they play Swan Lake and you see her dance to it, this is his Swan Lake.
It's muscle memory.
Right. Politics is his game. He
Yes.
knows it inside and out. He knew what he was doing.
He knew exactly what he was doing. And look, I do think that obviously he's cognitively failing, but he has been for a long time. I mean, it was evident back in Iowa and New Hampshire in the beginning of January of 2020. I saw it with my own eyes. So did everyone else there. He needed to be led on stage by Jill Biden. He needed teleprompters for basic stump speeches. So he wasn't in good shape then. But I've also talked to people, foreigners who've been in meetings with him during his presidency, and they say that when they met him, for the most part, he was lucid, totally in control, wasn't really looking at notes, and the people around him, like Antony Blinken, were deferring to him. He has gone downhill since, particularly with his spatial sense, but I think he still has moments of clarity and knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the Democrat Party kind of implode around this. And to your point, you have some of the richest people in the country saying, okay, we need to move him out. We need to move someone else in. And it was sort of funny to watch the Democrats jockeying around that. You had Gavin Newsom always waiting there. And then the minute he saw that it was her, he disappeared, which I also find fascinating because a lot of the others stayed around. They did the bus tour and they were like, oh, we are the loyal ones. I think that was a show to those donors. I think they are not as seasoned as a Joe Biden. And so they didn't know what to do. They figure, okay, if it's either way, if it's Kamala, we're going to still be out there. But if it's Donald Trump, we need to be ready in 4 years. And they thought that was the best move. I think they totally failed. I think it's been a very interesting political cycle. What do you think? I'll ask you this and then, I'll end on this. Tell me what you think the future brings for a Democrat Party that had all of the show, and I've talked about this before, all of the show of Beyonce and Oprah and all of this, and George Clooney coming out and speaking about, we got to dump the guy, we got to get someone new. And all of this production value that came out of it. You had these governors who went on the bus tour that did these corny videos. And I said that for Donald Trump, he went out and he was himself. I think this was a big difference between Donald Trump and the Democrat Party. He went on TikTok, and that's a big issue right now. He went on all of these different social media platforms as Donald Trump. He went on all these podcasts as Donald Trump. But the Democrats came out, and because I think they're the party of Hollywood, they came out and they spoofed it. They made themselves someone else. They tried to trick people into thinking they were cool. And they flatlined. And now they have to come back from that. What is the next iteration of the Democrat Party? How do they recreate themselves from this disaster?
Well, I mean, you're so right. They are so fake. Everything about Kamala Harris and her campaign was fake. And Donald Trump, by contrast, is the opposite. What you see is what you get with him. He's always wearing the same red tie, the same suit. He does a little Trump dance. He's just Donald Trump. And whatever environment he's in, people can see, they know now who he is. And actually, although the Democrats are constantly saying he's a liar, and the Washington Post and New York Times fact check him, and they take his humor or his sort of exaggerations and call them lies. Really, I mean, Donald Trump doesn't have a filter. And sometimes that is, to his detriment, because he speaks his mind. He doesn't seem able to keep his thoughts to himself. And as a politician, that's kind of a high wire act, but it's refreshing, particularly in the face of all the fakery that we got from particularly the Kamala Harris campaign and Joe Biden. Joe Biden's entire presidency was fake. He was the man who wasn't there. And I think for the future, John Fetterman's seen it. He's sort of the authentic Trumpian character, and he's going along with common sense, what he calls common sense, which is really the basis of MAGA policies. And the donors were really burned. $2.5 billion was wasted in 108 days by the Harris campaign. And, you hear, I listen to a lot of the Democrat podcasts, and there's a lot of burning anger there. Grace talks about it. The donors are not going to pay another penny. They want to know where that money went. They want an audit. You hear that Oprah got millions of dollars, that money was just squandered. Beyonce, there's some rumor she got $10 million for that appearance. What? And she didn't even sing. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, you'd have to waste that kind of money to go through $2.5 billion. That's with the campaign and a PAC. And they came out, I think, 100 million or 10 million, whatever it was, they were in debt in the end. Quite disgusting. And so, Donald Trump won spending a fraction of that money. And I think, people will look at sort of fiscal rectitude and think, well, how can you trust a candidate who can't even manage their own campaign in a prudent manner? And so I think that the Democrats will have to go, I mean, if they want to be at all relevant in the next decade, they're going to have to go back to basics. But at the moment, none of them really, apart from Fetterman, show any signs of doing that. There's no remorse. They just seem to be doubling down, saying, oh, we weren't woke enough.
No, 100%. I mean, we see it here in Michigan. We've seen it across the country. It's funny that you bring up Fetterman, because that's what I keep hearing. Like, Fetterman's thinking of running for president. And I think, wow, this is such a change from, when he ran against Oz, we were like, I mean, he was coming back from being very ill. That stroke really harmed him. And now he's almost like, he's the conservative side of the Democrats, and he was a super progressive. It's just like, how bizarre that they would think. And I, when I heard that, I honestly thought that's nuts, until you just pointed out that he actually is just like, whatever, this is who I am, take it or leave it. And that seems to resonate with the American people. So I don't, maybe there's a chance for a John Fetterman, and that would make a very interesting race.
Well, certainly I think he'd have a better chance than Kamala Harris, who's mooting a run for 2028. And
I cannot believe it. I want it.
Yeah, well, wouldn't it be great? Another Harris-Vance debate. That would be, terrific. But I don't think the Democratic Party is going to put up with that. I don't think that the Gretchen Whitmers and the Gavin Newsoms and the Josh Shapiros, who are sort of the obvious candidates at the moment anyway for 28, are going to put up with being consigned to the back row again.
No, I think they're going to send them back to wash their greens in the bathtub. That's what. That was another moment where people were like, "What?
I know.
No one does that. That's a lie. You didn't do that." It's so funny, but it's been great to point it all out. And you have such an insight on this stuff, Miranda Devine. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much, Tudor.
And thank you all for joining us on the Tudor Dixon Podcast. For this episode and others, go to TudorDixonPodcast.com, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time. Have a blessed day.